Let's head into the last empty places with author Peter Stark and broadcaster Jimmy Mack. A podcast about the adventure of getting lost to find yourself. Join Peter and Jimmy as they head into places where sometimes the only lights are the stars, and the only guide, your wits.
Being lost isn't a failure, it's a skill. Americans have been losing themselves since the moment they arrived here, in wildernesses, cities, frontiers, leadership crises, and cultural moments. And, well, one of the things at the last empty places, with Peter Stark, who joins me on the launch of this podcast, we're going to be discussing over the next couple of weeks, maybe the next couple of years if we get too far gone, why getting lost matters and how to navigate uncertainty in this modern world and sometimes in the previous one. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, Peter Stark. How are you, sir?
Very well, and eager to go exploring with you.
So let's just kind of start off with the fact that, we've been doing this for a while, and I think introducing what we've been doing for a while in a very, very different format and introducing ourselves is probably a really good place to start. As I said before, I'm Jimmy Mack. You are Peter Stark. You are a celebrated author, adventurer, etc. You and I got a beginning on this that was very, very different than we ever thought it would be. I mean, it was just a simple interview that kind of became something else. So tell me a bit about yourself through the filter of how you and I got to know each other.
Well, that's an interesting story. I can fold my complete biography in there, but I'll refrain from the whole biography. Really, we met through a book that I wrote called Young Washington about George Washington's travails as a young man in the wilderness of the Ohio Valley. All true stories, and it was George Washington that was much more of a piece of work than he came to be. Came to be a great leader, of course, but that it was the wilderness aspect of this guy stumbling around that really caught my eye, and that's sort of what I do as a writer. I started out, I grew up in Wisconsin, adventurous family, went to college in New England, got a master's in journalism back in Wisconsin. And then, I started thinking like, okay, where do I go from here? And I quite quickly got into writing about adventures, and especially for Outside Magazine, outdoor adventures. And at that point, I was putting myself in these sort of extreme situations, like throwing myself off a ski jump, learning from the old Norwegian ski jumpers. That article that was the first one I did for Outside, and it was like 1984, 1985, and they titled it "Leaps of Faith." And so that was really kind of what my whole career has been one leap of faith after another in this sort of adventure exploration writing world. And at a certain point in my 40s, I ended up paddling an unexplored river in Africa in a kayak, and it was on a small expedition. And it was, you talk about last empty places. This is severely last empty places. And, there were hippos and crocs and waterfalls around every bend of the river. We had no idea where we were going. And at that point, I had small kids at home, and I thought, this is as far as I'm going. This is the apex of my exploration adventure career. And so I started writing about historical explorers and adventurers. And that's how I got into people like George Washington in these difficult situations in the wilderness. And along the way, I'd written a book along these same lines called Last Empty Places, where I took I looked at a nighttime photo, like a NASA satellite nighttime photo of the U.S. at night. And this was on the advice of a satellite geographer. And I was wanting to go to the least populated areas. And he said, well, get that photograph, whatever, the Landsat 7. And he said, well, and just look at the U.S. nighttime photo, and then see where the lights are, and then you go where they're not. And so that's how the book, the concept came to be, Last Empty Places. And I ended up exploring, two places in the East and two in the West. And George Washington was in one of those places, Western Pennsylvania. So that's how this all kind of came to be.
It's interesting too because I read Young Washington and I was immediately like thrilled because when I first started the job, and I was the host of the Dave Nemo show on Thursdays, Fridays, and then Dave Nemo weekends, and Saturdays, Sundays on Sirius XM. And one of the things that Dave and I always tried to do was remember that we were creating shows for truckers, not creating just trucking shows. And it was always about giving them stuff that they could read or listen to while they were out there on their adventures. So when I got the Washington book, it fell into this amazing sweet spot. We already had a segment called Revolutionary Road with the Journal of the American Revolution. AllThingsLiberty.com was a regular contributor for the 4th of July. We had the Revolutionary War Museum on the air on the 4th of July on its opening day. So
Wow.
All of it was right up my alley. And the thing about the book that really hit me, along with the idea of using the wilderness as a point of becoming, because the idea that, you craft a picture of George Washington as a very ambitious, somewhat ruthless, looking out for himself, callow young man who then, it's Dimwitty, right, is the governor.
Governor Dinwiddie, yeah.
Yeah, Dimwitty. The governor sends him on this expedition to survey the land, but also to deliver a message to the French saying, get out of the Ohio Valley. And by the way, the Ohio Valley is all just one big part of Virginia, as the story goes. But what really hit me in the story was the sense that it was the first time I had read a book where the details of surviving the trip were part of the structure of the book. Like you lay out how many calories a horse needs to eat every day. At what point do you need 2 horses to carry the gear? At what point do you need 2 horses to carry the additional food for the other horse? And just like a gas tank on a car or a truck, you start reading this book and counting the food supplies, going like they need more food, not just for themselves, but for the horses. Because if these horses kill out, they got real problems. And at some point they have to eat the horse. And I remember and you came on and we ended up talking for much longer than we were supposed to. And I reached out through Clare, the producer, asked if you would be interested in doing a regular segment. And I immediately got a copy of The Last Empty Places when I read what it was about. And I'm like, we should just do a segment on that. We should just do a segment because we got all these guys driving across the highways and byways. They love this stuff. They love talking about this stuff, and this would be a great segment for the 3rd Friday of every month of the Dave Nemo show on Sirius XM. And the problem was we'd run out of time every segment we ever did before we really got going.
Every segment.
Every single one. There are times we did 3-part segments where we'd like be cut off. Like it was one point when you were talking about the end of the world over in Portugal, and you were getting ready to go there, and the first episode ended up being you explaining it. The second episode ended up being you there, and then the third episode ended up finally getting to the history of the end of the world over in Portugal. And that's how it played itself out. And so we said to ourselves, "Hey, man, let's do a podcast weekly. Let's create something on a weekly basis that actually, allows people to kind of, follow us with a bit more momentum and not just waiting for the next episode next month to come out." And that this already kind of formalizes it well. That's fantastic.
And I have to jump in here and say that it was such a natural fit, and the way you explain it now, I understand why it was such a natural fit that we hit it off instantly. And, when you're talking about the young Washington and the actual kind of tangible details of being in these pretty extreme wilderness situations, and with an expedition like Washington's, and the logistics involved, and the difficulties of movement, and of keeping an expedition like that supplied, as you're saying, you need, for one horse, you need 2 horses, and then you need more horses, that it so much fits in to the pattern of what drivers are dealing with on the road, truckers with fuel and distance and all the logistics. And so you had the show, many shows for truckers, and that it just was sort of a natural fit. And so one of the things I've wondered about, I just gave you my brief biography. Did you drive trucks for years, or what? What's your connection? And then and plus, why do you know so much about literature? Because I feel humbled and kind of stupid every time you start talking about books and movies and plays.
Well, maybe movies and plays, I might have a little bit of an edge on you, but book-wise, I think anybody that reads the chapter on the Acadian forest in The Last Empty Places know what kind of thick description, deep reader you are. Your approach to Walden in that book is pretty fantastic. I have a PhD from the University of Washington in theater history and criticism. It's a history PhD. It just happened to be focused in the area of theatrical performance. My dissertation looks at 3 to 4 case studies of leadership, bad leadership, and how it theatricalizes itself. The idea that you take Nero, who actually takes a Roman triumph and uses it to kind of celebrate his own acting victories over in the Greek Olympics. Charles I, who used Thomas Decker's play, A Game at Chess, to actually become a propaganda piece. It was the longest running Elizabethan Jacobean play in history. He used it as a propaganda piece to start a war with Spain, only because his feelings got hurt. And then finally looked at Gabriele D'Annunzio's march on Fueme at the end of the First World War. Notice a lot of people are marching in my stuff. People are always marching, going someplace. And what I argue in what Gabriele D'Annunzio does I don't know if you know the story. I'll keep it very brief. Yeah. So at the end of World War I, the Italians had swapped sides, and one of the reasons they swapped sides was they were supposed to get a number of ports on the Adriatic Sea. They're supposed to get a number of ports on the Mediterranean as well, too.
From the Axis side that was supposed to give them ports?
No, the spoils of war, that they swapped sides. They went over to the Allied sides. Yeah. They did it because they've been given certain guarantees, and Woodrow Wilson shows up and says, nope, no backroom deals. And a city, Fueme, which was, very Italian in its culture, but was going to be one of the central important pieces to the new Yugoslavia, this new country called Yugoslavia, it was given to the Yugoslavians. And so this poet warrior, Gabriele D'Annunzio, and that was, in fact, his real name, he stages a march with disgruntled veterans, syndicalists, futurist, anarchist. He's got an action secretary named Guido Keller who steals like 12 military trucks. And they march on Fueme. They convince the army at the border to join them. They seize the city and hold it for a year. The socialist, this is crazy, the editor of the socialist newspaper is a young man named Benito Mussolini.
Okay.
And you can make an argument that he watches what works and he watches what doesn't, and he stages the same damn thing when he takes Rome in the early 20s, and that he replicates the march. And the idea, and of course, both marches are replications of the famous march on the black shirts marching, what is it, Garibaldi marching on Rome, the man who actually offered, 1,000 Italians for the Civil War, to end slavery. I mean, so that's kind of my background in regards to history. And I love movies. I was raised in, much like you, raised by people, who had a certain love of learning, but a certain love of adventure and going places. And I've done a lot of stuff. I have been as hardworking as being on the loading docks of grocery stores and as esoteric as being in the office of a university. So I've done a lot of stuff. And seen a lot of places.
And driving was part of it in there?
My biggest claim to fame driving is that my brother had 2 companies. He parlayed one into the other and then sold the second one. The first company was a moving company. Simple as that, driving the truck, loading up the trucks and getting people to their new lives. Interesting, by the way, as far as this show goes, the idea of becoming often involves moving. And the other time was he ran I want to call it an installation, weatherization company, which of course involved a lot of truck driving because of the equipment and the parts and all that kind of stuff. So that I do have a sense of how big those things are. I would call myself more of less a professional truck driver and more somebody that actually understands it. How I get into this is kind of remarkable. I met a beautiful woman, and they introduced me to Dave Nemo, and I have a large background in journalism. That's the other thing. I've worked for 2 newspapers and done some radio stuff. The thing is, Peter, it's, adventure becomes your variety. Working in different areas becomes my variety for writing and all that kind of stuff. So that's and I'm a native of the city of New Orleans. So my adventuring tends to be more urban exploring than yours, although I have no problem as a Boy Scout, and even beyond that, I've hiked to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. I've walked many a major battlefield and camped out overnight there and all that kind of stuff. So I don't have any problem with being out in the big open places either. But when it comes to, I'm a big fan of walking cities, going to, abandoned factories, heading out to places where there has been industrial decline, but also kind of checking out what those worlds are like. I love all that kind of stuff. So I gravitate towards this. And like I said, I'm also hoping to use this podcast as an excuse to go more places and justify it that way too. So,
and I would say you are a child of the Enlightenment. What do they call it? Like a polyglot? No, not polyglot, polymath, where you have many, many different areas of knowledge.
Yeah. Only thing I wish is I wish it had occurred to me to actually do a better job learning foreign languages when I was 6. But I can't be faulted for the lack of cognizance at the time. That's my only regret in regards to learning is I wish I had taken the time to really master 1 or 2 other languages when you really have a shot to master 1 or 2 other languages. So that's it.
But you grew up in New Orleans, and you're sort of imbued in different cultures. The swirl of different cultures there that's almost a language in itself. To that embracing of different cultures.
Well, and the thing is, in regards to our experience of being Americans, and this is really applicable and important for what we're going to be talking about, is that your experience of being an American is what I call the river runs through it sort of experience. What I call, that whole Wisconsin and further out west angle, the real West, as opposed to, what George Washington considered the West, which was the Ohio Valley, the old Midwest. You really, where you live now, where you've been, where where you hope to go, all of that stuff really takes place in what I call the last empty spaces. I always call the wide open places. The kind of place where you come over the hill and you can't believe that the world that you're in could get any more beautiful, and you come over the top and it is. So where's the last place you traveled, by the way? Just to give people a sense of that you're still out there, still doing it, despite your protestations of not going down African rivers anymore.
Well, I should tell the listeners that I'm sitting here in Missoula, Montana. A beautiful university town in the mountains. And so in a way, every day is a travel for me, looking out the window at the mountains. And I ended up here in a very random way. I was looking for a remote spot after graduate school. And I'd interviewed for newspaper jobs in Alaska. And then I was taking a train from Seattle back to Wisconsin, and it went through Montana. And I thought, wow, this is pretty remote. And I literally got off the train, called an editor back in Wisconsin who had worked in Montana. Hey, I'm in Montana. Where should I go? Oh, go to Missoula. If you like Madison, you'll love Missoula. So that's how I ended up. That's
a good comparison, actually. Yeah. It's like a smaller version of Madison, smaller, slightly less radical version of Madison.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I've got some funny stories about that. But the last places we've been, this was a really fun one, and it's usually our travels are not just cushy, but my college roommate from Dartmouth, Corey Bach, and we lived a year as roommates in Cambridge, Mass. After college, kind of trying to find our ways, and I was trying to write a novel, which was memorably unforgettable, and and Corey was he's a great guy. I love him, and and I've laughed. I wonder, like, did he feel guilty about not being always a respectful roommate about whose food was in the refrigerator or what? Last spring, he invited wife Amy and me on a free canal boat trip in France for a week or 10 days, and he would pay for it all. And
wow.
And so
I've had a couple of trips like that. By the way, having friends who are willing to do that for you is like, I got a chance to go to Sao Paulo last year, year before last, sorry. And it was a friend of mine took care of so much. He said, if you can get the plane ticket, I'll take care of the rest.
Well, it was so generous. And I mean, there was a little bit of an ulterior motive. Is that Corey had a fairly new girlfriend. I mean, they were getting to know each other, and they both loved to travel. And on this, this canal boat, I thought it was going to be an old wooden barge. No, these are like kind of luxury French yachts that you drive yourself on a sort of obscure river in sort of south mid France, not so far from the Lascaux caves, called the River Charente. And the River Charente, I think you say, is, it has a lot of locks because it was used for shipping, like it's where the town of Cognac is. So it was used for, shipping the cognac up to England and places like that on these barges. And so there are a lot of old locks, which you have to go through in your luxury French riverboat. But you have to work the locks yourself, which they're like these big wheels that you turn and these big chains that open the doors of the locks. And, Corey with his really wonderful woman, Robin, I think was starting to think, like, now if Robin has to go out there and work all those locks on her own, this might not be so good. And so he recruited
So who are the
Amy
people that are my age that are the strongest people I know? I mean, is that what he did?
And so, yeah, right. So he recruited, in a way, Amy and me for crew, lock workers, but also thinking that we'd all get along really well, which we did. So it was just this fantastic trip.
Trifecta. It's trifecta. It's an act of kindness for a friend, a chance to impress the lady with really interesting friends, and then finally, I need the help. I need lock help. So yeah, kind of perfect.
And this river was so cool. It's in a way, it's another last empty place, but it was at the center of the French Empire 500 years ago, and now it's very kind of quiet. But it was where essentially cognac was invented, and so in like 1500, that brought a lot of wealth to this little river. And so even now, you go down this little river, and there are these incredible French estates. They're like summer cottages almost, but they're wine estates, and some are abandoned and some are fully running. And so that was another, it was kind of like a last empty place of France. And it was known that King Henry IV of France, it was his favorite river in his whole realm. And it's, this river's only like 100 feet wide or a little wider in some places, but it's not huge. But he just loved this river, and I can see why. So anyway, that's our last crazy trip.
Let's kind of set some rules here as we kind of move forward. And since we've been mentioning the word empty over and over again, let's kind of talk about what makes an empty place. What creates a space that is empty? So give me a definition of empty. And I got one I cooked up. By the way, some of this stuff is planned. We actually talked about this beforehand. This is one of the questions, but we'd love anybody who is listening to make comments as well too, in the comment section about what empty means to you. But we'll start with you, Peter. What do you got?
Well, my mind's in the River Charente right now. Why I call that empty. But it is true. When I was writing the book, The Last Empty Places, I was really looking for what today are really unpopulated areas of the U.S. And, I left out Alaska and various wilderness areas and national parks. And what I realized was that centuries ago, these places, a lot of them were not unpopulated at all. I mean, for one, there are a lot of native tribes in many of these places that, seem like forest. But there were, whole communities and villages and complexes of villages in many of those places that we might not now call empty, or that the initial British settlers called it wilderness. But in fact, it was really populated with tribes, and many different tribes in many different parts of the continent, living in many different ways and surviving many different ways. So in a way, there's no place that's empty of human understanding at some point in the past. That the evidence keeps coming in that there's been human presence in the Americas now is pushing up to around 20,000 years. And so just fairly recently, there was a discovery made in the white sands of New Mexico, family of human footprints preserved in the what was mud at one point, now sands of the white sands, and they're dated to over 20,000 years old. So I mean, you think about the white sands as being except for the nukes, but being a big, barren, empty place, and here you have these human footprints, a whole family from 20,000 years ago. So that's one of the things that I learned about empty places, is that in a way it sort of shifts around, that when the first humans arrived in this continent, and some people think they were always here, there were places that were not populated with humans. And so that's the first definition in my mind, is a place that is not populated by humans, at least now, and a place where one is on one's own, that there's not a lot of human infrastructure or human help or human connection, and that it's in a way, it's a different dimension of time and space when you're not immediately connected everywhere.
This is great, because my definition is different.
Okay.
And I am, while at the same time agreeing with yours, not taking issue with yours. For me, empty means a space where the entrant has such a limited knowledge of the territory that it becomes a blank canvas to fill with the outer edges of possibility, hope, and terror. Possibility, hope, and terror. If the empty space turns out to be familiar, it is almost a disappointment. And the idea, go back to the most famous quote of all time, the most famous quote about an empty space, empty place, which of course is, "Here there be dragons."
Here there be dragons.
Here there be dragons. And I think about the idea of terra incognita, the idea that, and I think it's great that you point out the fact that none of these places were empty. There are times when they were filled. Or, when we think filled, we think about a city, but I mean, you can have a vibrant ecosystem of humanity existing in very, very wide spaces where that humanity only interacts in regards to its needs before returning to its distance. But it does set up the possibility that a space and a place can be empty and then be empty again, meaning the space can be empty, fill up, and then become empty again. That the last empty places don't mean that there's always last empty places.
That's a really good point. There are always last empty places. And just to key off for a second on what you were just saying about, if it's familiar, it's not really an empty place. And so in a way, it's the place that's unknown to you. It's unfamiliar and unknown. It's unexplored terrain, either geographically or metaphorically. And so there be dragons is both a geographical statement and a metaphorical statement. Like, we don't know what the hell's out here.
We don't know what the hell's out here. And that's why there's often a disappointment. That's one of the great jokes that people will have a grand adventure into what they think is, it's a movie trope, it's a literary trope, a grand adventure into some place like a deserted island or something, and then come around the other side of the island and find a hotel, or, head down the river, head down this crazy river experience, and then get to the end and there's a dock with a bar, and and the idea is that, there is because it sets up the second question we had, which actually, the second question that we had for each other actually sets up a chapter of a book you turned me on to recently, which is, why do some people seek uncertainty? There is a kind of person who goes into these places, who goes into these spaces and into these places. A certain person, I'm talking to one of them, as a matter of fact, who is gravitationally pulled towards this. Everybody isn't pulled towards it. There's a lot of people who are like, oh, I ain't part of that. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there be dragons, there be mosquitoes is enough to turn a lot of people off. You know what I'm saying? But what's the gravitational pull for you, Peter? I guess the best way we can talk about that uncertainty is to talk it about through your lens, because I have a different take about cities, but it's something very similar. So what draws you in?
That's a great question. And it's funny that you asked me that question, because I kind of forget about it, but there was several decades of my life that was absolutely driven by getting to the most remote places I could find in the world. And I mean, literally, meaning Tibet or way up the Amazon or deep into the Arctic. And it was like I had literally a driving passion to get there. And it was almost as if I expected to find a different reality there that would, contain, I'm putting this kind of baldly simply, but that it would reveal some wisdom that I didn't have, that it would teach me something that I didn't know, that it would help me figure out something. And I didn't even know what the problem was. I mean, I had a lot of problems, but exactly what the remote place, what that was going to solve or address, I couldn't tell you exactly, other than I thought there would be something I would discover there that would be really meaningful in so many ways. So that's between the time I was literally 12 years old until that river trip down the Lugenda River in Africa with the hippos and the waterfalls around every corner.
Well, you did see it. You did see ended up seeing the thing.
I did see it. I did see it. And so I succeeded. And it was also, finding traditional societies. I was very, still am, really drawn to that. And the world is changing so quickly. I felt this driving need to get to many of these places before these societies lost their kind of traditional culture and the sort of pre-Western culture.
Well, it's interesting too, because, this is the great dilemma of the explorer. You want to see these things in their pristine state, but the moment you arrive, it is no longer the old adage about the perfect church. The moment you step into that church, it's no longer perfect because there you are and you are not perfect. And it's the same kind of thing. Exactly. The idea that the later you get there, the more exposed they are to other cultural currents and the less, we're not talking about Rousseau's state of nature here, this kind of purity back to nature stuff, but the idea of seeing something that other people haven't seen before that isn't of itself unaffected by the forces that often shape our own lives. It's interesting. The reason I love to travel, the reason I love to go to places and see different things is that my great push, you're out there looking for, you talk about the idea of the revelation. I want to be able to see the world again. And what I mean by that is not the literal meaning of that, but what I really want to do is I won't see my life, meaning like I will drive home from work or I will take a walk. When you take the same walk every day, no matter how brisk, how wonderful, how invigorating it is, after a while you stop seeing everything. You stop seeing the walk. It's kind of like the thing about Walter Benjamin and the Mona Lisa. The idea that if you're looking at it in picture books, if you're looking at paintings and pictures, they no longer have their meaning. And then you go to the museum and you see them, and what has been lost has been restored. And I often find that going other places both invigorates you in the seeing of something new, but also allows you to come back home and see what is there as well, clearer than before. It's almost kind of a way to awaken your senses, that our senses become dull. We close down to all the We've talked about the idea of looking and living peripherally, being aware of your surroundings. And I think that so much, if you don't get out there enough and explore new places, your peripherals begin to slowly shut down.
Yeah, you lose that sort of sharpness.
Yeah, you lose that sharpness
of perception.
Yeah, and the uncertainty forces every single one of your senses to the surface, and you now know where I'm going about chapter 4 of that book. But all of your senses come back to life when you don't know where you are.
Exactly, and we should say too that this podcast, Last Empty Places, that's the overall name of the podcast, and we're going to do a whole season or seasons, but the first season that we're really addressing, which we'll talk more about next time, is the art of getting lost.
Perfect word. The art of getting lost, leaving yourself open to the possibility of getting lost,
and the art of getting lost and found again. And so we'll be talking a lot more about that in the future, but it sort of keys off of what we're talking right here is that heading into the unfamiliar, the way I put it for my youth was, the remote places, the empty places. It's sort of a sharpening of consciousness. We'll talk more about that in terms of getting lost, but simply going in an unfamiliar place, whether you're lost or not, is something that is sort of transforming in a way.
Well, and like I said, when we get to next week's episode, we're going to talk more about that. The idea, I think that, one of the reasons why getting lost in America means so much is that how can you find yourself if you didn't lose yourself in the first place? I mean, you can't find yourself. And the idea that, and we'll dig into this more next time around. But the idea that, this country, the real purpose of this country, I think, and everybody's got their own interpretation of why we're here, is that almost everybody who arrives here arrives from a fixed point, meaning that they are who they are and they can be no one else. Whether it's the caste system of India, whether it is the feudal system of Europe, whether it is the highly hierarchical structure of Japan, or any of the other worlds they come from, so much of the rest of the world, and that's changing because America's greatest export is itself. But the idea that you get lost to become something else, because in finding yourself, it wasn't like that when you lost yourself, a lot of people were more than pleased to lose themselves. They're looking for a new identity.
I love that idea, that metaphor about America. And we should really maybe pick that up next time on the podcast about getting lost and that concept of finding yourself and how there's so much American about that. It's such an American process in a way.
It may be the most American thing we do, and I find that there has been recently a rejection of that. And like I said, I don't mean that from a political standpoint. There has been a rejection. There has been a timidity that seems to kind of have infected not just us, but the world. And maybe this podcast will encourage a couple of you guys out there listening to go out and have an adventure and throw away the map. Because next week when we come back, we're going to talk about the idea that when the map gets thrown away or kicked in the river or lost in a storm, that there are ways of finding your way back home, even if that home is a new place. It's good to have you. It's good to see you. It's good to be back again doing this. I would ask you guys to check out these wonderful announcements from Clare Marie coming up here. And until then, I'm Jimmy Mack.
And I'm Peter Stark.
And we will be talking to you on the next episode, coming to you soon.
The Last Empty Places is a Planet Clare production and lives at peterstarkauthor.com. Listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all your favorite platforms. Write to us on the contact page at peterstarkauthor.com. And in the meantime, head on out and find an adventure.